I think that it's time to start our event now. So thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I'm very excited to see these many people joining our event today, which is a good signal that the topic of climate change investment start to draw some attention from the general public. And to help all of us here better understand which kind of stakeholders are among the early adopters of this topic, I would like to invite all of you here to participate in a quick warm-up activity from us. Our technical team, can you please, let me see. Chị không thấy screen. Chị không thấy luôn. Yeah, so you can see on the screen, you can see a little QR code. Please use your phone to scan the QR code. If you prefer to use your computer, it's totally fine, it's totally okay. Our technical team will share a link via our chat box. So the first step, people please use your phone to scan the QR code. Go to slide do. One of our friends to help us interact with each other. Okay, so after scanning the QR code, you can see a screen of two tabs. So there is on the top of the screen, there are two tabs, the Q&A tabs and the poll tab. So for the Q&A tab, this will be the main tool for you to ask any kind of questions for our speaker here today. So during his speech, please feel free to type any question that you want to ask. And you can also upvote the question that you like the most. And for now, for this little warm-up activity, please tap the poll tab. Yeah, I can see a lot of you start playing. It seems like you do not need my instruction. Yeah, oh, students. We have a lot of students and investors and entrepreneurs here. Yeah, maybe we will spend the next 1 minute for people to choose. Oh, we do have government authorities. Oh, a lot of students. Wow, a lot of students here. Anyone? Oh, we can see a lot of investors and students and entrepreneurs as well. Oh, we do have some not-for-profit organizations. Oh, we also have some big corporations joining with us. Very interesting. Oh, very interesting. Very diverse background. Yeah. So the audience joining our event today come from diverse backgrounds, which will be a plus because by the end of this event, we do host a mini networking section. Yeah, so please stay with us till the end of the event to join the networking section. Okay, I think that's for our mini warm-up activity. So I myself come from the private sector, VC, and please allow me to spend the next couple of minutes to give a quick introduction about our movement. I promise you it won't be long. Yeah, so my name is 𝐿𝐸𝐞𝐿 from Earth Venture Capital, a global VC seeking to invest in digital solutions tackling climate change. So we are on technologies including AI, machine learning, platform, blockchain, IoT, or even robotics. So, and furthermore, we consider climate change as an investment theme, which touches multiple industries and verticals, including but not limited to agri-tech and food system, forestry, industrial decarbonization, energy efficiency, renewable energy adoption, climate fintech, so on and so forth. So as a group of investors and entrepreneurs, we believe in the power of entrepreneurship in the fight against climate change. And this event is within the scope of the Climate Change Entrepreneurship Hub, an initiative from Earth Venture Capital with the generous support from the Irish Embassy together with Friends of Ireland. And on behalf of Earth Venture Capital, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the Irish Embassy and Friends of Ireland for making this happen. Thank you so much. Yeah, and believing that addressing the climate crisis requires a system approach to develop the Climate Change Entrepreneurship Hub, or CCE Hub for short, to gather and connect people from diverse backgrounds who share a common belief in sustainability as an inevitable pathway and also as an enormous business opportunity at this time. Yeah, so some key stakeholders include investors, entrepreneurs, scientists, experts, not-for-profits, and hopefully we can also invite someone from the public sector to join our community as well. So please get connected with us and stay tuned for more exciting events and activities in the near future. Not only events, we also host a lot of community activities in the future. So yeah, please get connected with us. And so for now, I don't want to waste your time any longer. So please help me to welcome our speaker today, Richard Yarrow. He is a visiting research fellow at the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore and a fellow at the Musavar Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard University. He has previously worked at the Harvard University Archives, Weatherhead Center for International Affairs, and a cross-section of think tank in Washington, D.C. Yeah, his expertise include macroeconomics, science, and modern history in East Asia. Yeah, so please help me to welcome Richard. Hey, Richard, over to you now.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction and for everyone who is taking the time to hear my presentation. Let me pull up my slides in just a moment. Okay, well, thank you again. So I will be talking today about three perspectives or three dimensions for understanding global trends in climate investments. Political side will be familiar to some of you. Monetary policy or the monetary environment is generally not associated very closely with startups or climate investments by most people within startups or climate investments, but is still tremendously important. And then the market technology side, which many people here have their own stories about tremendously innovative and tremendously productive new technologies that are available at much cheaper and better prices. But I'll give a quick system-wide overview focused on cases in the US and China and what we might understand from some of those cases. So to begin, on the political influences for climate investment, we see influences at pretty much all levels of politics, all different kinds of orderings. At the very highest level of international geopolitics, relations between heads of state, there are a growing number of international agreements, accords, meetings that are all determined toward mitigating the problems of climate change. It dates back to the Kyoto Protocols over 20 years ago, Paris Accords about 5 or 6 years ago, the COP meetings more recently, wide range of declarations held at G7 and G20 meetings, including potentially at the upcoming G20 meeting, which will be hosted by Indonesia later this fall, and an increasing trend of environmental standards being built into multinational trade agreements in the first place, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the US-Mexico-Canada agreement signed a few years ago, which had not previously been taken into perspective in multinational trade accords. Within each country, at the highest level of each country, pursuing climate change and trying to create global solutions to mitigate climate change is increasingly important for countries' national image. So one might say nationalism has been driving climate investment in some ways, but nationalism driving climate investment in a good way, in that heads of state, major political figures have been seeking to assert their country's pride and prestige through its contributions to the global effort to mitigate climate change. So here we see Chinese General Secretary talking about how China will lead the way in building a global ecological civilization and ensure China's central role in building a more ecological global civilization. And almost identical language in the United States, even though the US and China are sometimes at loggerheads, almost identical language about how the US highest level leaders seek to build American prestige and American leadership over a world society in the domain of mitigating climate change and pursuing climate investments. So this is a very strong driver, not just in the US and China, but one can see similar examples in many countries. To add on to these drivers, within particular countries, there have been growing momentum to build up new regulations, investments and subsidy frameworks to encourage greater climate investment. What was very famous in the last 20 years, in the mid-2000s, was the European Union devoted very heavy subsidies toward building out renewable energy infrastructure, which turned out to be less successful at building a manufacturing infrastructure around renewable energy, but was quite successful, at least in Western Europe, Northwestern Europe, at building renewable energy generating capacity. More recently, the European Union has, the leaders of the European Union have spoken about imposing taxes or fees targeting carbon emissions on imported products into the European Union, combining trade protectionism with environmental friendly orientation, which could have a big impact if it gets passed, implemented. And in China, renewable energy construction has been a major policy at the national level and in basically every province. And one can see extremely dramatic consequences of the focus on renewable energy investment. China's exports of solar panels have increased by an order of magnitude in only a few years, and capacity of solar power production in China has also increased by a magnitude, from order of magnitude, from under 5% to, I believe it's over, a few years ago, to I believe it's over 10% of installed capacity today. Outside of the state political context, we also see increasing, exponentially increasing public pressure or mass pressure of a political form on companies. So one notable example is the major oil companies of the United States, such as Exxon and Chevron. And just within the last few years, both suffered shareholder defeats by shareholders who are pressuring the corporate boards to have greater accountability and take greater public stances related to climate investments and propose greater transition policies about how the company will fare under a decarbonized economy. This kind of shareholder vote is unprecedented from the perspective of 30 or 40 years ago, but now it's happening at an increasing rate, and not only at the oil majors, but also at a variety of other major industrial companies in the US, such as United Airlines. Many people here are familiar with ESG standards, environmental, social, and governance standards, but these have been one of many examples of new forms of political-based pressure on companies, where investors have created new mechanisms for evaluating companies based on environmental performance and then steering capital to companies that prioritize climate-related investments. Now, in the last 3 or 4 months, especially, we see yet another renewed form of momentum behind climate investment, which is over the Ukraine invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces at the beginning of this year. United States and Western Europe and many Western countries, such as Japan and Singapore, imposed sanctions on Russia in response to the invasion. And the invasion has created a new impetus basically everywhere in the world to finding alternative forms of electricity to reduce dependence on oil supplies and on Russian fossil fuel supplies in particular. So one can see the dramatic political turn in Japan. Ever since the Fukushima disaster, many Japanese civilians were resistant to relying on nuclear energy. And in recent months, both security and climate pressures came together to reverse people's previous opposition or reduce people's previous opposition. And one finds similar trends elsewhere, similar trends in Germany, France, other countries about people supporting whether it's nuclear energy or greater investment in solar and wind and other renewable energies in order to reduce energy security pressures. So to recap, one sees growing political-based pressure around climate at the highest levels, international treaties, to countries' reputations, to new investments and subsidies and regulations within governments, to mass pressure, as well as new energy security pressure. Move on to monetary context. This is an area that many people don't think of typically when they think about climate investments, but is tremendously important. To give a brief recap on the monetary context for the last 20 years. Over the last 20 years, the world has seen a massively, dramatically growing increase in money supply, the amount of currency in circulation, the amount of currency in existence relative to global economic production or relative to economic activity. But inflation rates in most of the world, especially in the West, have been very low. So a lot of new money has been created, but this money has not been filtering down to average households or consumers, which then spend the money and drive inflation. So where does the money go? Well, in many economies, newly created money has been disproportionately going to big institutions, governments, large businesses, industrial outfits, or banks or financial institutions. You can see in the US case, venture capital assets under management has increased dramatically over the last 10 years. And in other countries, the chart on the right is the case of Germany. A growing share of national savings have been held in deposit or controlled by a mix of government and large enterprises. So what does it mean that governments and large enterprises have growing shares of national savings, of a growing money supply? Well, investors, whether it's a big industry or a big bank, have to deposit their savings somewhere. Where does it go? In many major economies, interest rates have gotten absurdly low. In Japan, for over 20 years, if you save money, you are basically losing money through inflation because interest rates are effectively zero. And even in countries that we might think of as less stable investments, interest rates or yields have gotten absurdly low as well. So the chart on the right shows bond yields in Greece and Italy, countries that were at risk of bankruptcy only a few years ago, within recent memory. There, just in the last few years, yields have gotten extremely low, below 5%, and are approaching zero. So you would be investing in a country that recently suffered from a potential debt crisis, and you're not gaining any chance of a yield, despite the risk. Now, investors want yields to keep up with inflation, They want to yield better than 0% on Greek government bonds. So where does the money go if you're searching for yield? Well, one possibility is highly speculative investments. That could be luxury real estate, it could be equities, or in the last few years especially, before maybe 3 months ago, was cryptocurrencies. The value of cryptocurrencies, or the amount of money flowing into cryptocurrencies, has increased exponentially. But another good component is that some of this money, some of this spare savings flowed into startups, and in particular climate-related investments. So while cryptocurrency has increased exponentially, the amount of money entering startups in the Silicon Valley area has also increased exponentially in the last few years. Now, just because clean energy is a good thing, and the goal of pursuing zero carbon is a good thing, doesn't mean it doesn't carry risks. Whenever one has a highly experimental or cutting edge new technology, there will always be enormous risks that the technology doesn't work, or even if it does work, it's not marketable. And clean technology in particular has had a difficult track record for investments. So these graphs come from an MIT study a little under a decade ago, showing that within their sample, clean technology firms or clean technology startups actually were disproportionately more likely to fail. The risks were somewhat greater. Nevertheless, when you have a market environment where yields are extremely low on traditional investments, and that's a fact driven by monetary policy, then even riskier clean technology investments start to look attractive. So more and more money will start flowing into clean technology investments, which, yes, they carry risks, but they're doing something good for the world, and they seem to be the pathway of the global societal and economic future in addition. The $1 trillion question, or $10 trillion question then, is now that the Federal Reserve and other major central banks, European Central Bank, are increasing interest rates, which means rising interest rates or rising yields on traditional investments like bonds. How much will change for the funding situation for startups? Nobody really knows, especially for clean energy startups, because we have a mix of different momentum coming from different directions. One sees political momentum. One also may see headwinds from monetary policy. So this is an area that we'll have to look out for in the coming few months and few years. To quickly recap, the world has seen an unusual growth in money supply and a growth in savings, especially savings that are heavily concentrated among large institutions, whether that's governments or businesses, less so households. This has created an environment of abnormally low yields, even for some high-risk investments, which in turn has the positive or potentially positive side of driving new funding into clean energy and climate-friendly startups. Nevertheless, monetary policy presents risks for environmental startups and environmental activity, because we don't know how much will change when monetary policy starts to tighten, as it's doing now. Now, to discuss the market side, the world has seen dramatic changes in market technologies that have been good for the environment. One particularly ironic market technology that has benefited the environment, benefited reduction of carbon emissions, is actually the production of natural gas in the US. Fracking technologies have been around for a long time, but in the mid-2000s, US drillers implemented new kinds of fracking technologies in the Great Plains states, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio in particular, and were able to produce enormously greater quantities of natural gas at lower prices, which in turn helped carbon emissions. You can see this graph. The US, bizarrely, was producing more natural gas than it ever had before, and yet America's energy-related carbon dioxide emissions declined, even the year after the US, or the same year the US left the Paris Accords. Now again, we can see just how dramatic this increase in US natural gas production was, effectively doubling or nearly doubling in only a handful of years, which is just an extraordinary rate, considering the capital scale and the difficulty of extraction. But natural gas is less carbon intensive than coal energy, and the increase in natural gas production was able to spur an enormous historic decrease in coal energy consumption in the US, resulting in emissions from natural gas increase, but not nearly as much as emissions from coal energy decrease in the United States. So even a fossil fuel technology was able to help the United States' energy or carbon emissions transition. Now let's look quickly at the renewable energy side. About 10-15 years ago, the cost of building a new wind energy facility in the US South was about, I believe, $1,700 per kilowatt hour of capacity. Now versus about $1,000, $1,100 for natural gas electrical facilities. Now wind energy in the US South is roughly cost competitive for installing a new facility per unit of installed capacity. And in much of the rest of the United States, areas where it's less windy or less sunny, renewable energy is similarly catching up. Here we see a levelized cost of energy analysis, which shows, in a way that was unprecedented just 10 years ago, wind and solar energy are getting to be roughly cost competitive for operating costs or construction costs with traditional forms of fossil fuel electrical generation. This is because of a mix of new energy technologies, improved technologies for producing renewable energy, as well as improved manufacturing capacity, especially in countries like China. Now, is this always a good thing, or is this a bad thing? The dramatic decreases in costs of renewable energy create a kind of dilemma for people who are investing. If you think the price of solar energy or solar panels is going to decrease by 50% in 2 years, then is your decision going to be to invest in new solar panels right now and benefit the environment and get cheaper energy right immediately? Or will your decision be to wait 2 years and then get twice the energy capacity that you had before for maybe half the price? This is a possible challenge that might get in the way of implementing some of the renewable transition in many countries, especially consumer-driven countries. Now, a further example of how market technologies are changing the climate investment environment is in the past, in the 1950s or 1970s, a lot of the major corporations had a business model of producing extremely technically complex, extremely capital-intensive machinery or equipment that could be provided to utilities, provided to manufacturers, or provided to large industries for the purpose of energy generation. So General Electric built a model this way, Toshiba built a model this way. Now, for basically the first time since the Industrial Revolution, we have technologies that can produce fairly easily, fairly cheaply electricity by households that households can undertake by themselves. And so we may be seeing a shift in the mega conglomerate or in major business models, away from the GE type company that sold capital intensive equipment to big utilities, which were the only ones that could afford it, or big industrial outfits, to integrated multi-service, multi-good conglomerates that provide services or resources directly to households. For instance, Tesla is a good example. Tesla started off saying we will provide you with electric vehicles. Then Tesla added various kinds of software to the electric vehicles, a suite of high-tech resources to make your car more pleasant, as well as to make it more environmentally friendly. And then Tesla started to expand and say, well, we'll also sell you the solar panel that will charge your car in the first place and might charge your house, or might provide energy for your house in addition. And this, again, is a very different business model from the kind of energy businesses that were seen in the West just 40, 50 years ago. So to recap, technology for climate has been improving tremendously. Free and open markets have helped the generation of new technologies for the environment. Markets sometimes can create strange incentives around these technologies. For instance, when do you buy or when do you wait to invest in something that's cutting edge? And there may be new models of businesses, entirely new approaches to making profits that are coming out of the availability of extremely cheap and effective forms of renewable energy and other kinds of climate-friendly technologies. Now I will give a quick comparison about the scale and types of climate approaches in China and the US. China has largely taken a top-down centralized approach to climate investment, which has worked tremendously well in massively scaling up renewable energy production. Currently, close to 45% of all installed generating capacity for electricity in China comes down to renewable or nuclear energy. Renewable including wind, solar, hydroelectricity, and biofuels. And about 33% of electricity production in China today comes from either nuclear or renewable sources, up exponentially from a few years ago. On the flip side, the US has been scaling up environmentally friendly measures from a more decentralized approach. The US is an economy driven heavily by household activity, household consumption, and the incentives for households in the US, guided in part by government policies and business investments, have been to steadily shift both to more energy efficient technologies as well as renewable technologies. So we can see in this graph, energy consumption by households is held roughly constant, even as the number of households in the US has increased and as the amount of technology in people's lives and energized electricity requiring goods have increased. So energy usage has become much more efficient in many domains. And many, many different states in the US have taken dramatically different approaches to renewable energy, allowing for wide ranges of local experimentation, which in turn has produced significant growth in renewable energy capacity in the US. Close to 40% of US electricity now comes from renewable sources, but enormous disparities between different states in how their electricity composition is structured. So thank you for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to questions, comments, and discussion.
Thank you so much, Richard. Very insightful presentation with a lot of information, charts, and graphs. So yeah, so now is the time for a Q&A section. We will have about 10 to 15 minutes for this part. So Richard, please take a look at the question list and pick some questions to answer. And for our audience, please feel free to continue asking questions via our Slido link in the chat box. You can all see the question now on the screen. Yeah, Richard, please, just pick up some question to, and have a discussion with our audience here.
Okay, let me pull it up on my screen.
Yeah, you can access to the question list on your computer, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Over to you.
Let's see, one moment. Sorry, the web page is loading. I'm refreshing. See, now it's only asking me if I want to ask a question. So I might have to rely on your screen to read the questions. So let's see. Potential sector to invest in clean tech globally and in Southeast Asia. Okay, I can answer. What are the potential sectors to invest? Wait, can you go back? Oh, what are the most potential sectors to invest in clean tech globally and in Southeast Asia? Can you name some examples? Well, certainly. Now, it's impossible to really predict where technology will trend 10 years ago, 10 years from now. In the 1960s and 1970s, everyone thought that fusion was the cutting edge and we would have fusion technology to produce clean, renewable electricity. And today in the 2020s, we still think fusion is the cutting edge. And at some point, we'll have fusion to generate clean, renewable electricity. So it's hard to say what are the most promising directions in the future. Some of the most interesting directions, I think, are the use of graphene to really reinforce materials and reduce a lot of the carbon emissions that come from construction and, for instance, concrete production or concrete maintenance, and lab-grown meats or artificially grown meats. An enormous share of the world's energy relies on agriculture or is used by agriculture. And a very large share of climate change generating emissions come from methane, which heavily comes from agriculture, from raising cattle or raising farm animals. So if we have the capacity to lab grow meat, then that could have really strangely enormous impact on carbon emissions for much of the world, as well as for improving people's livelihoods if that can be a cheaper and more efficient way to produce meat. In Southeast Asia in particular, a lot of the existing forms of renewable electricity production are primarily developed in and for northern hemispheric environments, developed in places like the United States and Europe, and for environments that resemble a bit more the environments of the United States and Europe. Countries like Vietnam don't necessarily have the space or the geographic conditions to easily produce large quantities of electricity from solar, which requires lots of sun as well as lots of space, lots of consistent sunlight, so no rain or no cloud cover, or wind, which requires lots of space and also lots of wind. So I think there's enormous potential for investing in new kinds of renewable energies that are better suited to the geographic conditions of Southeast Asia. I talked to Tao about this, but one possibility would be extracting electricity from wave energy, which is only minimally experimented on or tried in the United States, but could be enormously beneficial and enormously easy for countries like Vietnam to gain a reliable, efficient, clean sources of electricity from. So that would be my quick answer on potential for investing in Southeast Asia. Okay, let's see another question. is sustainability ESG really sustainable, such as solar panels are not clean since it awfully pollutes the environment because of components, chemicals exhaust? That's an excellent question and an excellent point. There will always, well, may not always, but we can expect to pretty consistently find some forms of environmental destruction or environmental problems with any kind of industrial or economic activity. I mean, when you use electricity, where is the electricity coming from? When you purchase a piece of fruit or a vegetable, how is that vegetable getting to you from the farm? What pesticides or fertilizers was the farmer using to produce that vegetable? Nitrogen fixation, the chemical process required to produce fertilizers. It's an enormously carbon-intensive process. So we can look around and point to environmentally destructive components of a wide range of activities, but we have to be pragmatic at the end of the day. Climate change is an enormous threat. Much of the threat comes down to how we produce energy and how we produce electricity. And solar panels do create devastation in certain areas from mining. The production of solar panels can in turn consume energy, some of which is fossil fuels. But on the other hand, this is the solution that we have now, and we can refine and we can improve on some of the problems in existing solar panel production. We can make mining more sustainable. So I think it's still generally the right direction to go. Is ESG really sustainable? Well, that depends on what's included in the ESG metric. There are lots of competing metrics out there, and you need to look at the particular metric. Okay, let's scroll up and see what are some of the other questions. Scroll up or down.
Yeah. Can you see other questions now? You will have 3 minutes left.
Oh, 3 minutes left. Okay.
Yeah, so maybe 2 more questions. Yeah,
okay. Let's do, so some people think that starting a business and climate change will require a lot of initial investment. Is there any chance for startups? I would say absolutely. There's always a chance for startups. It depends on what the startup is focusing on. Whenever one develops a completely new or experimental technology, there'll be a lot of costs and a lot of risks. But there's also enormous potential for startups that take an existing technology and find a better way to distribute it and market it to a large number of consumers or in a geography where it didn't previously exist. That is, in a way, the brilliance of Apple. Apple was not the first operating system, but it refashioned an operating system and was able to sell it in a brilliant way to a much wider and different array of consumers. So I think there's absolutely potential for startups, even if you don't invest in highly risky new technologies. Let's see, I see there are 3 new responses. Can we scroll up to some of those?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's see.
Yeah.
Is that the, keep scrolling. Let's see, how do, carbon trade, which they can clean tech funding, role of government intervention, reasons why solar significantly increased adoption is the great subsidies. Okay, a lot of great questions. I can quickly answer the, I know we're running out of time, quickly answer the question, how important is the role of government intervention? One of the reasons why solar had significantly increased adoption was the great subsidies provided by government. It's certainly true if you look carefully at the levelized cost of energy analysis for different forms of electrical production. The very low bars for costs of solar is a bit artificial because those bars are incorporating government subsidies. At the end of the day, someone still needs to pay government subsidies. It's still coming in. You can't get the money from nowhere, so to speak. Now, the flip side is subsidies were enormously important at the early stage of solar adoption, especially in continental Europe. But increasingly, they genuinely are getting cost competitive. And there are meaningful new incentives for solar that can exist to some extent without, increasingly without government subsidies or without government intervention. If one looks at the Energy Information Agency for the United States, their data from the first few months of 2022, the United States is on track for roughly a 30 or 40% increase in renewable energy production generated by households, not from big businesses, not from utilities, but simply individual families putting up a solar panel in their backyard. 40% year-on-year increase in total production. That's a staggering number. It's very hard to find utility statistics on the order of 40% year-on-year increases. So yes, some of that is due to government subsidies, but government subsidies have been around a long time. When you have orders of magnitude increases like that, I think a lot of it is really coming down to simply the price of solar is getting much cheaper, and the incentive is getting pretty significant for ordinary people to invest in. So yes, there's still subsidies, but I think the key role of government intervention always is to support new technologies that have some risk, but not so crazy an amount of risk that it's just burning taxpayer money. That was the case for the adoption of the internet. That was the case for, you might say, space travel or space shuttles, which are now increasingly moving into the private sector. It's the case for satellites and plane technology. And I think it's the case for renewable technology too. Solar is becoming increasingly affordable, even without subsidies. Wind certainly is. But there are other new cutting edges of technology out there, which governments still should invest in because they're not affordable. Like extracting electricity from waves in the ocean would be a great example. Hopefully that addresses the question.